The fire reached for the Montana sky like fingers clawing at heaven. Orange light painted the snow-covered pines in hellish shades of amber and gold. Inside the burning cabin, Garrett Kane pressed his back against the only wall not yet consumed by flame. Ash, his German shepherd, stood between him and the door, Hackle's raised teeth bared at shadows moving through the smoke. "Federal agents inbound," a voice crackled through a radio somewhere in the chaos. "Repeat FBI is 1 minute out." Garrett looked at the digital clock on his phone. 6:47 in the morning. 13 minutes before the deadline. 13 minutes before the truth went public, whether he lived or died. The ceiling groaned. A timber beam crashed down, sending up a constellation of sparks. This was not how Garrett Kane had imagined spending the winter of his 42nd year. But then again, nothing in his life had gone according to plan. 48 hours earlier, the world had been different. Colder, perhaps. Quieter, certainly. But not yet on fire. The Flathead County Courthouse Annex smelled like wet wool and desperation. It was the kind of building that had witnessed 100 years of human misery and learned to hold its secrets close. The heating system wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the January cold that seeped through every crack in the foundation. Garrett sat in the back row of folding chairs, his frame too large for the cramped space. He wore a canvas field jacket that had seen better decades, the fabric stained with oil and the dust of 1,000 miles. His hair was military short, touched with gray at the temples. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and they held the particular emptiness of a man who had seen the world break and no longer expected it to mend. Beside him on the cold linoleum floor, Ash lay perfectly still. The German shepherd was 7 years old, black and tan, with the bearing of a soldier at attention. His ears rotated constantly, tracking every sound in the room. To the casual observer, he looked like a well-behaved pet. To anyone who knew working dogs, he looked like exactly what he was, a retired military K-9 who still scanned every room for threats. The auction had been going for 40 minutes. Ranch land mostly, timber parcels, a few foreclosed properties that nobody wanted. The crowd was sparse, a handful of local ranchers in the front rows, their weathered faces betraying no emotion as they bid on their neighbors' misfortunes. Garrett wasn't there for any of the properties on the official list. He was there because 6 months ago, a counselor at the VA hospital had told him he needed to find a place to disappear, a place where the nightmares couldn't follow, a place where the weight of 12 years in the Marines and 3 tours in Afghanistan might finally lift from his shoulders. He hadn't believed her then. He didn't believe her now. But he had saved $17,000 from disability checks and odd jobs, and he figured buying land was better than drinking it away. The auctioneer, a thin man named Silas Harden, with a voice like gravel in a bucket, shuffled through his papers. The room had grown quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause between lots, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a funeral. Harden cleared his throat. His hands trembled slightly. "Next item," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "Parcel 7B, the Old Cross property. 50 acres of timberland, including the homestead and North Creek access. Starting bid is set at $500 for back taxes." Nobody moved. The silence deepened, became almost physical. Garrett had heard the stories. Everyone in Flathead County had. Benjamin Cross had been a fixture of the community for 30 years. A quiet man, a hermit who kept to himself in a cabin up the mountain. 3 years ago, in the winter of 2022, he had simply ceased to exist. His front door had been found wide open. A half-eaten meal sat on his table covered in mold. No tracks led away from the house. No body was ever found. The land had sat empty since then. The trees had grown wild, reclaiming the narrow access road. The locals whispered about lights in the forest at night, about sounds that didn't belong to any animal that walked the Montana wilderness. Garrett didn't believe in ghosts. He had seen enough real monsters in the deserts of Helmand Province. The supernatural held no terror for a man who had watched friends die in sudden violence, who had carried pieces of them home in a canvas bag. But he believed in opportunity. $500 for 50 acres was a steal, haunted or not. 500, Harden repeated, his voice hollow. "Do I hear 500? The ranchers in the front row exchanged glances. They were men who dealt in harsh realities. Drought, wolves, blizzards that could kill a herd in a single night. But they avoided Parcel 7B like it was poisoned ground. Garrett raised his hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, final. 500, he said. His voice was a low baritone that seemed to resonate in the floorboards. Every head in the room turned. The ranchers stared at him with expressions that mixed pity and something deeper, something primal. They saw a stranger, a veteran with the hard edges and careful movements of a man who had seen combat. They saw someone who wanted nothing from his neighbors, which in a small town made him more suspicious than someone who wanted everything. Hardin's gavel hovered in midair. He looked at Garrett with eyes that searched for signs of a joke or perhaps signs of madness. He found neither. Garrett's face was as unreadable as granite. "Sir," Hardin began, then stopped. The weight of the room seemed to choke the words back down. At Garrett's feet, Ash lifted his head. The dog's ears went forward, his body tensing in a way that Garrett had learned to recognize over 5 years of working together. It wasn't aggression, it was alertness. Something had changed in the room, some subtle shift in the emotional temperature that only the dog could sense. "Going once," Hardin whispered, "at $500. The clock on the wall ticked. The heating system groaned. Outside, the January wind threw ice crystals against the windows. "Going twice." One of the ranchers, an old man with a face like cracked leather, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something. Both men looked at Garrett and shook their heads slowly. "Sold," Hardin said and brought the gavel down. The crack of wood on wood echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space. Garrett stood. The folding chair scraped against the floor. Ash rose with him, moving with the fluid precision of a working dog. They walked toward the clerk's desk through a narrow aisle between the chairs. As they passed, the ranchers pulled their knees back, clearing a path as if Garrett carried something contagious. The clerk was a gray-haired woman with bifocals and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. She pushed the deed across the counter with the tip of her pen, refusing to touch it now that Garrett's name would be written on it. He signed with a steady hand. He counted out 5 $100 bills, money he had saved over 6 months of loading trucks at a warehouse in Kalispell. The bills were crisp new. They felt like possibility in his calloused fingers. As he turned to leave, a hand caught his sleeve. It belonged to the old rancher who had been whispering earlier. His name was Abernathy. He owned the general store on Main Street and knew the history of every rock and stream in the county. "Son," Abernathy whispered, leaning close enough that Garrett could smell peppermint and old tobacco. Benjamin Cross didn't just leave that place. He vanished. Into the air. "That land's got a memory. It don't like being owned." Garrett looked down at the old man's hand, then up into eyes clouded with cataracts but sharp with warning. "The land doesn't have to like me," Garrett replied, his voice empty of emotion. "It just has to let me sleep." Abernathy shook his head, his lips thinning into a grim line. "You won't find sleep out there, Kane. You'll find why the rest of us stay in the light." Garrett pulled his arm free gently and walked through the heavy double doors. The cold Montana air hit him like a fist. Snow was falling, fat flakes that caught in his hair and melted against his neck. Ash pressed against his leg, the dog's warmth a small comfort in the biting wind. They climbed into Garrett's truck, a battered black Ford that had 200,000 miles on it, and showed everyone. The engine coughed to life with a puff of blue smoke. As he pulled away from the curb, Garrett looked in the rearview mirror. The courthouse windows were filled with silhouettes dark against the interior light. They watched him go like mourners at a funeral. He shifted into gear and pointed the hood toward the jagged peaks of the Cabinet Mountains, where the shadows were deepest and where his new life, or perhaps his end, waited in the heart of Parcel 7B. The logging road to the cabin was a nightmare of decay. What had once been a maintained access route was now a gauntlet of fallen timber and erosion. Garrett's truck groaned as it climbed the four-wheel drive, struggling for purchase on ice-slicked gravel. Beside him, Ash sat perfectly still, his yellow eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of Douglas fir ahead. The road didn't just end. It died, choked by vine maple and stunted hemlock that seemed to have reclaimed the earth with predatory hunger. Garrett killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was profound, pressurized by the weight of the mountains overhead. He stepped out. The hinges of the truck door screamed in protest. The air here was different than in town. Colder, thinner tasting of wet stone and something older. Something that had been rotting since before men walked these hills. Ash leaped from the pump, his paws hitting the frozen ground without a sound. The dog didn't wander. He didn't investigate the scent trails of deer or squirrel. He stood at Garrett's heel, ears rotating, processing information that human senses could never detect. They started walking. The trail was barely visible, more suggestion than path. Every few yards, a massive tree had fallen across it, the bark slick with neon green moss. It felt less like the work of storms and more like a deliberate attempt by the forest to hide something. Garrett pulled a machete from his pack and began clearing the smaller branches. His breath came in white plumes. The only sounds were the rhythmic thunk of blade on wood and the quiet click of Ash's nails on exposed rock. 20 minutes of hard hiking brought them to a clearing. The cabin emerged from the gloom like something unearthed from a grave. It was a low structure of hand-hewn logs, the wood weathered to the color of old bruises. The roof sagged under decades of snowfall. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the oppressive trees. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb that the mountain had tried to swallow. Garrett paused at the edge of the clearing. His skin prickled with the phantom sensation of crosshairs. It was a feeling he had learned to trust in the valleys of Afghanistan, the sense of being watched by terrain itself. He signaled to Ash to stay and approached the porch alone. The steps groaned under his boots, a rhythmic protest that echoed too loudly in the stillness. The front door hung slightly ajar on a single rusted hinge, inviting the cold inside. He pushed it open. The hinges screamed. The interior was a time capsule. The air was thick with the smell of cold ash, old paper, and the faint, musky scent of mice. Garrett clicked on his tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a surgical blade. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling around the relics of Benjamin Cross's existence. On a heavy timber table sat a ceramic mug, a ring of dried black residue at the bottom. Beside it lay a pair of reading glasses and a book, a thick volume on mountain flora spread open to page 142. The spine was cracked, as if someone had just stepped away to stoke the fire. A wool coat still hung on a peg by the door, its pockets bulging with work gloves and a tin of tobacco. The cast iron stove held the frozen remains of someone's last meal. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no overturned furniture. Benjamin Cross had simply been subtracted from the world, erased mid-sentence. Garrett moved deeper into the cabin. His light swept over a kitchenette, a single bed with military corners still crisp, a bookshelf filled with field guides and technical manuals. Everything was in its place, everything except the man who had lived here. Behind him, Ash whined. It was a sound Garrett had never heard the dog make before. Not fear exactly, something more specific, more urgent. He turned. The dog stood in the center of the main room, his legs braced, his head lowered. Every muscle in Ash's body had gone rigid. The dog's fur began to rise along his spine, a jagged ridge of alarm. Ash wasn't looking at the dark corners or the open door. His eyes were locked on the massive stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. The hearth was built of heavy river stones, soot-stained and cold, topped by a mantle made from a single lightning-scarred beam of cedar. It looked ancient, permanent, immovable. Garrett shifted his grip on the flashlight. His other hand drifted to the Glock holstered at his hip. "Ash," he said quietly, "what is it?" The dog took a single stiff-legged step toward the fireplace. His lip curled back, revealing white fangs. The growl that emerged from his chest was so deep it felt like a vibration more than a sound. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. He scanned the stones, looking for movement, for the flash of eyes that might belong to a snake or a cornered animal. He saw nothing but cold rock. Then he remembered Kandahar. He remembered mud-walled compounds where the Taliban hid weapons caches and Soviet-era ammunition. He remembered how Ash had acted then, using that same specific, high-pitched whine. The dog wasn't sensing danger. He was marking a void, a hollow space behind solid matter where something had been hidden from the light. Ash lunged forward, his front paws slamming against the stones of the hearth. He began scratching frantically at the mortar between them, his claws making a desperate scraping sound that set Garrett's teeth on edge. Garrett knelt beside the dog. He ran his gloved hand over the stones, feeling for a loose edge. The air near the fireplace felt colder than the rest of the cabin, a localized pocket of frost that seemed to seep from the cracks. His fingers brushed against a large, flat stone near the base. It gave just a fraction of an inch, barely perceptible, but enough. He realized then what Abernathy and the others had sensed. This wasn't a haunted house. It was a crime scene. Benjamin Cross hadn't disappeared into thin air. He had been protecting something, or trying to bury it. Garrett stood and returned to his pack. He pulled out a 30-inch crowbar, the iron cold and heavy in his hands. Ash backed away just enough to give him room, but the dog's eyes never left the stone. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the hairline fracture. The first pull yielded nothing but a screech of metal on rock. He braced his boots against the heavy timber of the mantel and threw his full weight into it. The stone groaned, protested. The mortar that had held it for decades fought back with the stubborn grip of time. Garrett pulled harder. His muscles burned. His breath came in ragged gasps that bloomed white in the frigid air. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cold. With a sound like a bone breaking, the stone shifted, tilted. A crack appeared running through mortar that was older than Garrett's lifetime. He dropped the crowbar and used his hands to heave the slab the rest of the way. It tipped over and hit the wooden floor with a thud that vibrated through his boots. A breath of stale, dry air escaped from the cavity beneath. It smelled of oil, old paper, and something chemical that made Garrett's nose wrinkle. He aimed his flashlight into the hole. The beam revealed a hidden chamber, a man-made void lined with treated plywood to keep out moisture. Nestled inside was a military surplus ammunition box, its olive drab paint chipped and rusted at the hinges. Beside it lay a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked with age, wrapped in heavy-duty plastic to protect them from the damp. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the cache of a madman. This was the archive of someone who had something to say and no safe way to say it. He reached in and lifted the ammo box. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the floor and flicked the rusted latches. They snapped open with a violent metallic protest. Inside were rows of small glass vials secured in foam inserts. Each vial was filled with liquid or soil meticulously labeled with dates and GPS coordinates written in precise block letters. He picked one up. The firelight caught the murky yellowish tint of the water inside. The label read North Creek Sector 4, heavy metal saturation 400% above legal limit. Sample date June 2021. Garrett's hands began to tremble. He set the vial down carefully and reached for the journals. The plastic crinkled as he unwrapped them. He opened the top book to a random page. The handwriting was cramped, urgent, but legible. It spoke of midnight convoys, of tanker trucks dumping chemical runoff into the headwaters of the valley, of a corporate entity called Nexus Mining Corporation that had been systematically poisoning the ecosystem for 15 years. Benjamin Cross hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been documenting its murder. Garrett flipped to the last entry dated November 2021. His breath caught in his throat. The writing said, "They know I'm getting close. 3 people before me tried to expose this, all dead within months. Car accidents, heart attacks, a drowning that made no sense. If you're reading this, you're probably the new owner of this land. That means I'm gone. They got me too. Garrett Kane, if this reaches you, know that you're the only person I could trust with this. We served together. You know what honor means. You know what it costs. The evidence is here. Every sample, every photograph, every recorded conversation. Nexus Mining has killed this valley to extract rare earth minerals worth $8 billion. Senator James Harlow is on their payroll. Sheriff Raymond Riggs is their enforcer. And the CEO, Silas Blackwood, is the kind of man who sees human life as a line item on a balance sheet. I tried to do this alone. Don't make the same mistake. Trust your dog more than you trust people. And if they come for you, remember, they can't kill the truth if it's already public. You're the last line, Garrett. Don't let them bury this with me. Semper Fi, Benjamin Cross. Garrett sat back on his heels. The flashlight trembled in his hand. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. Cross had known. Somehow he had known that Garrett would end up here. Had known that the land would be auctioned. Had known that a fellow Marine wouldn't be able to resist $500 for 50 acres, even if it was cursed. A memory surfaced sharp and clear. Afghanistan Forward Operating Base Shkin, 2012. Garrett had been a corporal, 22 years old and terrified, though he'd never admit it. Cross had been his platoon sergeant. It was the night before a patrol into a village that intelligence said was crawling with Taliban. Cross had found Garrett sitting outside the barracks at 0300, unable to sleep. "Can't shut your brain off?" Cross had asked, sitting down beside him without invitation. "No, Sergeant." "Good. The day you stop being afraid is the day you get careless. Fear keeps you sharp." Cross had lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the darkness. "You know why I requested you for this patrol tomorrow?" "No, Sergeant." "Because you don't quit. I've watched you in training. You're not the fastest, not the strongest, but when everybody else is ready to tap out, you keep going. That's worth more than all the talent in the world. What if I freeze up out there? What if I... You won't. You know how I know." Cross had pointed to where Titan Garrett's first K9 partner lay sleeping. "Because that dog trusts you. And dogs don't trust cowards. They smell it on you. Your dog thinks you're worth following into hell, so you probably are." The patrol the next day had gone bad. An IED had hit the lead vehicle. Titan had alerted 30 seconds before it detonated, giving them time to scatter. 3 men had been wounded instead of killed. Cross had written Garrett up for a commendation. "You saved lives today, Kane," Cross had said afterward. "You trusted your dog over your own fear. Remember that lesson." Garrett had carried it with him through 3 deployments, through firefights and ambushes and the grinding tedium of occupation duty. Trust the dog. Trust your training. Don't quit. And now Cross was dead because he'd tried to fight corruption alone, because he'd trusted the wrong people or not trusted enough of the right ones. Ash whined again, softer this time. The dog moved closer and pressed his shoulder against Garrett's leg. The warmth and weight of the animal was grounding real in a moment that felt like falling through ice. Garrett looked at the vials. 47 of them. 47 pieces of evidence that could dismantle a billion-dollar operation. 47 reasons why Benjamin Cross was dead. 47 reasons why Garrett Kane had just become the most dangerous man in Montana. He closed the journal carefully. He packed the vials back into the ammunition box. His hands were steady now, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled explosives in war zones. The rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived, hammering against the roof with a sound like nails being driven into wood. A window pane in the kitchen shattered under the force of the wind. Cold air swirled into the cabin, bringing with it the scent of pine and coming snow. Garrett stood. He looked at Ash. The dog sat watching him with amber eyes that held a question. "We're not running," Garrett said aloud, though whether he was speaking to the bard or to himself he couldn't say. He thought about the faces in the courthouse, the fear in their eyes, the warnings from old Abernathy. They had all tried to tell him, but none of them had known the truth. This wasn't a haunted cabin. It was a bunker. And Benjamin Cross hadn't been a hermit. He had been a soldier on a mission that had gotten him killed. Now that mission belonged to Garrett. He carried the ammunition box to his pack and secured it carefully. The journals went in next, wrapped in waterproof bags. He swept his flashlight around the cabin one last time, committing every detail to memory. Then he and Ash walked back out into the storm. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that sounded like a promise. The hunt was no longer about a missing man. It was about a war that had been raging in silence while the world slept. And Garrett Kane, whether he wanted to or not, had just enlisted for his 4th tour. This time the enemy didn't wear a uniform. They wore suits and badges and held the power of law and money. But Garrett had something they didn't. He had the truth. And a dog who would die before he let anyone take it. The wind howled through the pines as they descended the mountain. Behind them, the cabin stood silent and dark, keeping its secrets for whatever came next. The first night in the cabin passed without sleep. Garrett sat in the darkness with his back against the wall, the Glock within reach, listening to the forest breathe. Ash lay at his feet, ears rotating toward every crack of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves. The ammunition box sat between them like a live grenade. When dawn finally broke, it came not with light, but with a gradual lessening of the dark. Gray filtered through the windows, turning the world into shades of charcoal and slate. Garrett stood his joints protesting and moved to the table where he had spread out the journals. Benjamin Cross had been methodical. Each entry was dated, each observation cross-referenced with photographs and sample locations. The journals spanned 3 years, from early 1919 to late 2021. Cross had tracked the dumping operations with military precision, noting the routes the tanker trucks took, the times they arrived, the GPS coordinates of each contamination site. Garrett opened one of the journals to a page marked with a frayed ribbon. The entry was dated March 20th, 2020. The handwriting read, "Tanker arrived 0247 hours. White Kenworth cab, no company markings. License obscured with mud. Driver wore hazmat suit. Dumped approximately 800 gallons into North Creek headwaters. Liquid was dark amber viscosity similar to motor oil. Chemical smell detectable from 200 yards. Collected sample NC-17. Creek runs through Callaway property before joining main watershed. Ruth's husband drinks from their well. He's been sick for months. Doctors can't explain it." Garrett turned the page. There was a photograph paper-clipped to the next entry. It showed a white tanker truck parked at the edge of a creek, a hose running from its tank to the water. The image was grainy, taken at night with a long lens, but the details were clear enough. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadows, was a man watching the operation. He wore a suit and stood with his arms crossed. Even in the poor lighting, there was something commanding about his posture. Cross had written beneath the photo, "Silas Blackwood, CEO of Nexus Mining Corp., present at dump site. Direct knowledge confirmed." Garrett studied the man's face. He committed it to memory. This was the enemy, not an abstract corporation, but a human being who had made the conscious choice to poison a valley for profit. He flipped through more pages. The pattern was consistent. Monthly dumps, sometimes twice a month, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same stretch of North Creek. The contamination would flow downstream, seeping into groundwater, accumulating in the soil where cattle grazed and children played. Another entry from June 2021 caught his attention. "3 people have tried to expose this before me. Michael Torres, environmental scientist, died in a car accident 3 weeks after filing complaints with the EPA. Sharon Weymouth, investigative journalist, heart attack at 42 with no prior cardiac history. James Nakamura, lawyer, attempting to file a class action suit, drowned while fishing in calm water. He was an experienced swimmer. The words were underlined 3 times. Cross had added, "This is not paranoia, this is pattern recognition. They eliminate threats. I may be next. If I am, this evidence must survive me." Garrett closed the journal. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. He had seen this before. In Kandahar and Helmand, he had watched warlords and corrupt officials operate with impunity because they controlled the local power structures. The uniforms were different here, the weapons more subtle, but the mechanics of power were the same. He needed allies, people who knew the valley, who had seen the sickness spreading through the community, people who might be willing to stand with him when the time came. Ash stood and moved to the door, his tail giving a single wag. Time to move. The drive down the mountain took 40 minutes. The logging road was treacherous in daylight, worse than Garrett had realized the night before. Twice he had to get out and clear fallen branches. The third time he found a tree that had been cut partway through with a chainsaw and left to fall naturally. Someone had been trying to close this road. Someone who didn't want visitors. He parked the truck 3 blocks from Main Street and walked. Flathead in winter was a study in muted colors. Gray buildings, white snow. The occasional splash of faded paint on a storefront sign. The businesses were the kind that survived on necessity rather than charm. A hardware store, a diner, a post office that doubled as a general store. Abernathy's general store occupied a corner lot with windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in a decade. A bell jangled when Garrett pushed through the door. The interior smelled like coffee and sawdust and the particular mustiness of a place where inventory sat unsold for years. The old man stood behind the counter, sorting mail into wooden cubbies. He looked up when Garrett entered, and something flickered across his weathered face. Not quite surprise, more like resignation. "Figured you'd be back," Abernathy said. His voice was rough as tree bark. "Either that or we'd find you frozen in that cabin come spring." Garrett approached the counter slowly. Ash remained at his side, watchful but calm. "I need information," Garrett said, "about Benjamin Cross, about what he was investigating." Abernathy's hands stilled on the letters he was sorting. He glanced toward the window, checking the street outside, then back to Garrett. "That's a dangerous conversation to have in daylight. Every conversation is dangerous now." The old man studied Garrett for a long moment. Whatever he saw in the veteran's eyes seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once and gestured toward the back of the store. "Come on, we'll talk where the walls can't hear." The back room was cramped, filled with cardboard boxes and old inventory. Abernathy pulled 2 folding chairs from a stack and set them facing each other. They sat. Ash positioned himself where he could watch both the door to the shop and the alley exit. "Ben Cross was a good man," Abernathy began. "Marine like you. Did 2 tours in the Gulf. Came back here in '07, bought that land, kept to himself. People thought he was strange, but he wasn't. He was just a man who'd seen enough of people's world to appreciate solitude." When did he start investigating Nexus? In 2019. His neighbor, Ruth Calloway, her husband, Tom, started getting sick. Muscle tremors, cognitive decline, lesions on his skin. Doctors couldn't figure it out. Tom worked his land, drank from his well, ate what he grew. Ben started testing the water. Found heavy metals, arsenic, lead, cadmium, concentrations that shouldn't exist in nature. Abernathy leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Ben started asking questions, following trucks at night, taking samples. He documented everything. He was going to take it to the state, maybe even federal. But then people started dying. The scientist who was going to test his samples. The reporter who wanted to write the story. The lawyer who was going to file suit. After the 3rd death, Ben went quiet, stopped coming to town, stopped talking to anybody. He was scared. He was smart. Scared and smart looked the same from the outside. Abernathy's clouded eyes fixed on Garrett. "You found what he hid." It wasn't a question. "I found it." "Then you need to understand something, son. Nexus isn't just a mining company. They own the sheriff. They own the county commissioner. They've got Senator Harlow in their pocket. There's no local authority you can trust. You go to the wrong person with that evidence, you'll end up like Ben." Garrett absorbed this. It matched what Cross had written, but he needed more than one old man's word. Who else knew? Who else saw what was happening? Doc Brennan. He's been treating folks in this valley for 30 years. He's seen the pattern. Cancer rates tripling, birth defects, neurological problems that don't make medical sense. Abernathy paused. And Ruth Calloway. She watched her husband die over 18 months. She knows. Garrett stood. Where can I find them? Brennan's got a clinic 2 blocks east. Ruth lives on the old Calloway Ranch about 5 miles north of your property. The old man rose as well, his joints cracking. But Garrett, you need to know what you're walking into. These people are desperate. They're angry. You give them hope and then fail, it'll break what's left of them. I don't plan to fail. Nobody ever does. The medical clinic was a converted house with vinyl siding and a handicap ramp that looked newer than the building. A sign in the window said Dr. Hollis Brennan, General Practice. Walk-ins, welcome. The waiting room was empty except for a receptionist who looked to be in her 70s. She glanced at Ash, then at Garrett, and her expression softened slightly. Service dog, she asked. Emotional support. PTSD. The doctor will see you. Room 2. Dr. Hollis Brennan was 58 years old with the kind of face that had seen too much suffering and not enough justice. His hair was more gray than brown, and his hands had the steady patience of someone who had set 1,000 broken bones. He looked up from a chart when Garrett entered. Mr. Kane, he said, I heard you bought the Cross property. I'm sorry for your trouble. Garrett closed the door behind him. You knew Benjamin Cross. I did. He was a patient. More than that, he was a friend. Brennan set down his pen. What do you want from me? The truth about what's happening in this valley. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and moved to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder thick with medical records and dropped it on the desk. 15 cases of aggressive cancer in the last 5 years, in a community of 800 people. The statistical probability of that occurring naturally is less than 1%. He opened the folder revealing charts and lab results. Thyroid cancer, liver cancer, kidney failure in patients with no genetic predisposition, children born with neural tube defects at rates 20 times the national average. He looked at Garrett with eyes that held a physician's helpless rage. I've been reporting this to the state health department for 3 years. They send inspectors who test municipal water, which is clean. They ignore the private wells. They ignore the soil samples. They ignore everything that might point to a source because the source has lawyers and lobbyists and money. Cross documented the source. I know, he showed me some of his evidence before he disappeared. I told him to go to the FBI, to the EPA, to anyone with federal authority. He said he tried. He said his reports got buried. Brennan's voice dropped. Then he vanished and I knew. I knew they had killed him to keep the secret. Why didn't you keep pushing? Because I'm a coward, Brennan said flatly. I have a daughter in college, a wife. They made it clear that if I kept making noise, accidents happen. So I stopped. I kept treating the sick, and I stopped asking why they were sick. He met Garrett's gaze. Can you live with that kind of compromise? Mr. Kane, I can't. It's killing me slower than the cancer is killing my patients. Garrett understood. This was a good man trapped in an impossible situation. A man who had chosen survival over honor and hated himself for it. If I bring this into the light, Garrett said, will you testify to what you've seen? If you can guarantee my family's safety, I'll testify to everything. I'll give you every record, every lab result, every death certificate that doesn't make sense. Brennan's hands clenched into fists. I want these bastards to burn for what they've done. I'll need your help with something else, Garrett said. When the time comes, I'll need someone on the inside, someone they don't know is watching. Brennan's eyes narrowed. What are you planning? I'm planning to make sure the truth doesn't die with me the way it died with Cross. But I need insurance. I need someone who can corroborate what I find. Someone whose testimony carries weight. You want me to wear a wire. I want you to document every conversation you have with anyone connected to Nexus. Build a parallel case. So when I go public, you can back me up from an independent source. Brennan sat down slowly. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something that looked like hope. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to give me a way to fight back, he said quietly. Tell me what you need. The Calloway Ranch was a collection of weathered buildings hunched against the Montana wind. The house was small, the paint peeling the roof patched with mismatched shingles. A single light burned in the kitchen window. Ruth Calloway answered the door after the third knock. She was 62, but looked older, her face carved with the lines of grief that didn't heal. She wore a cardigan sweater and held a dish towel in her hands. Mrs. Calloway, Garrett said, my name is Garrett Kane. I bought the Cross property. Her eyes went to Ash, then back to Garrett's face. Something in her expression shifted. You found it, she said. What Ben hid. Yes, ma'am. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread. She gestured for him to sit at a small table while she poured coffee into chipped mugs. Ash lay down near the door, his eyes tracking her movements with the calm assessment of a professional. Tom died in April 2023. She began without preamble. The doctor said it was a rare neurological disorder, untreatable, progressive. He went from healthy to bedridden in 18 months, lost the ability to walk, to feed himself, to recognize me at the end. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Ben Cross came to me a month before Tom died. He showed me water samples from our well, showed me the chemicals, told me what Nexus was doing. "I'm sorry," Garrett said. "Don't be sorry, be angry." She sat across from him, her eyes hard. "Tom was a good man, worked this land for 40 years, never hurt anyone. He died because some corporation decided profit was more important than human life, and nobody did anything. Not the sheriff, not the health department, nobody. I'm going to do something." Ruth studied him the way Abernathy had, searching for something beneath the surface. "Ben tried. He died for it. I know, but he left me the evidence. He left me a path." Why did he think you'd be the one?" Garrett considered the question. "Because we served together. Because he knew I wouldn't walk away from a fight. Even a fight you can't win, especially then." She nodded slowly, accepting this. She stood and moved to a drawer, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Garrett. "Tom wrote this 2 weeks before he died, when he could still hold a pen. He wanted someone to know. He wanted it to matter." Garrett unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the words were clear. "My name is Thomas Calloway. I am dying because Nexus Mining poisoned my land. They poisoned my water. They poisoned my body. I am not the first, and I will not be the last. Someone must stop them. Someone must make them answer for what they've done. I hope whoever reads this has the courage I did not." Garrett folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I'll make it matter," he said. "Ben said the same thing. Then they killed him. I'm not Ben. I've been training for this kind of fight my whole life. I just didn't know the battlefield would be Montana instead of Afghanistan." Ruth's expression softened slightly. "You have that look. Tom had it too when he was younger, before the war took it out of him. Korea in his case." She refilled her coffee cup. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony, when the time comes, and until then, silence. Nobody can know I've talked to you. Nobody can know what we're planning." "Planning what?" "To make sure that when I go public, it's so loud and so public that they can't silence all of us. They killed Cross because he worked alone. They won't be able to kill a dozen witnesses all at once without it looking like exactly what it is. You're building an army. I'm building a case. An airtight, multi-sourced, impossible-to-bury case." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and placed her weathered hand over Garrett's. "My husband died believing nobody cared. Died thinking his suffering didn't matter. If you can prove him wrong, if you can make those people pay, I'll testify to anything you need." By the time Garrett returned to the cabin, the afternoon sun was already sinking toward the peaks. Long shadows stretched across the snow like fingers reaching for the darkness. He parked the truck in the clearing and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had allies now, not many but enough. A doctor who could testify to the medical evidence. A widow who carried her husband's last testimony. An old man who knew the history and the physical evidence. Cross had collected 47 vials of proof and 3 years of documentation. It should have been enough. It should have been more than enough to bring down Nexus Mining and everyone connected to them. But as Garrett climbed out of the truck, he saw the fresh tire tracks in the snow. Someone had been here while he was gone. The tracks led right to the cabin door. Ash tensed immediately, his hackles rising. A low growl started in his chest. Garrett drew his Glock and approached slowly. The cabin door was closed but not locked. He had locked it before leaving. His heart rate climbed, but his hands remained steady. This was familiar territory, approaching a potentially hostile structure. Clearing rooms, maintaining situational awareness. He pushed the door open with his boot and swept the interior with the pistol. The cabin had been ransacked. Drawers hung open as supplies scattered across the floor. They had been looking for the evidence. They hadn't found it because it was in the truck, locked in a concealed compartment Garrett had installed years ago. On the table, held down by a rock, was a business card. Garrett picked it up. It was heavy stock embossed with gold lettering, Sheriff Raymond Riggs, Flathead County Sheriff's Department. On the back, written in pen, welfare check, Wanted to make sure you were settling in. Stop by the office when you can. The message was clear. We know where you are. We can come whenever we want. You're being watched. Garrett pocketed the card. He moved through the cabin, checking corners, looking for anything they might have left behind. A listening device. A camera. But they had been smarter than that. This was just intimidation. A reminder that they had power here. He was cleaning up the mess when he heard the sound of an engine. Not a truck. Something larger. Heavier. The deep rumble of serious displacement and expensive engineering. Ash was at the door immediately, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. Garrett looked out the window. A black Escalade was rolling into the clearing, its chrome gleaming, even in the fading light. It was pristine, unsuited for mountain roads, a vehicle that cost more than most people in Flathead made in a year. It stopped 20 yards from the cabin. The engine continued to idle, exhaust venting white plumes into the cold air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened. The man who emerged was 48 years old and moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no in a meaningful way. He wore a charcoal gray parka that probably cost $3,000. His hair was silver at the temples, perfectly styled. His face was handsome in a corporate way, with sharp lines and cold eyes. Silas Blackwood, CEO of Nexus Mining Corporation. He walked toward the cabin like he owned the mountain. Maybe he thought he did. Garrett stepped out onto the porch before Blackwood could reach the stairs. He didn't bring the gun, but he positioned himself so his jacket was open and the holster was visible. "Mr. Kane," Blackwood said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I apologize for the intrusion. I thought it was important we meet face to face." "You're trespassing." "Technically, yes, but I wanted to have a conversation before things become unnecessarily complicated." Blackwood stopped at the base of the steps, close enough to talk, but far enough to maintain a respectful distance. "I've heard you've been asking questions about Benjamin Cross, making some concerning inquiries around town." "Concerned about what?" "About things that are better left in the past. Ben was a troubled man, PTSD from his service. He developed some paranoid delusions about this valley, about my company." Blackwood's expression was sympathetic, rehearsed. "I understand you're dealing with similar issues. The VA has excellent programs for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life." Garrett's jaw tightened. The implication was clear and insulting. "You're crazy like Cross was. Don't believe what you found." "I know what I found," Garrett said evenly. "I'm sure you think you do, but documents can be fabricated. A troubled mind can see conspiracies where none exist." Blackwood reached into his coat, moving slowly. He pulled out a leather checkbook and a gold pen. "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, Mr. Kane. $50,000 for this property. Right now. That's 100 times what you paid for it." "Not interested." "That's a great deal of money for a man living on disability. You could buy a house in town, get proper treatment, and start over somewhere that doesn't carry so much weight." Blackwood opened the checkbook. "This is a one-time offer. Walk away now and we'll forget this conversation ever happened." Garrett looked at the checkbook, then at Blackwood's face. He saw no conscience there, no doubt. Just the absolute certainty of a man who believed money could solve any problem and erase any obstacle. "Benjamin Cross wouldn't sell," Garrett said. "He knew what you were doing. He knew about the dumping, the contamination, the people dying." The mask slipped, just for a second, but it was enough. The corporate smoothness melted away, revealing something cold and reptilian underneath. Cross was a fool who didn't understand progress. This valley sits on $8 billion worth of rare earth minerals, elements that are essential for modern technology, for national security, for the future. Blackwood's voice hardened. One backwards community's health concerns don't outweigh that kind of strategic resource. "They do to me." "Then you're a fool like he was." Blackwood tucked the checkbook away. "Cross is dead, Mr. Kane. He died because he couldn't see the bigger picture. He died because he made himself an obstacle that needed to be removed. Do you want to end up the same way? Is that a threat?" "It's an observation. The cold is very dangerous in these mountains. Accidents happen, equipment fails. Sometimes people just disappear and nobody ever finds out what happened to them." Blackwood's eyes were dead emotionless. "Take the money, leave, while you still can." Behind Garrett, Ash stepped onto the porch. The dog's hackles were fully raised now, his lips pulled back to show teeth. A growl emerged from his chest, deep and sustained. Blackwood took an involuntary step back. Even men who believed themselves invincible knew to fear 70 pounds of trained aggression. "I'm not selling," Garrett said quietly. Not for 50,000, not for 5 million. I know what's in those vials. I know what you did. And as long as I'm standing on this land, you're never going to touch it. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the distance. Then Blackwood smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. A poor investment, Mr. Kane. You had a chance to walk away rich. Now you're just a man standing in a graveyard waiting for your turn. He turned and walked back to the Escalade. Before getting in, he looked back. The cold isn't the only thing that kills in these mountains. Remember that. The Escalade spun its wheels, throwing snow and gravel as it roared back down the logging road. Garrett stood on the porch watching until the taillights disappeared. His hands were steady. His heart rate was elevated but controlled. He recognized the feeling washing over him. It was the same sensation he'd had before combat. The knowledge that violence was coming and couldn't be avoided. Ash pressed against his leg, the dog's warmth a reminder that he wasn't alone. "It's going to get bad," Garrett said aloud. The dog's tail wagged once. Whatever came, they would face it together. That night, Garrett didn't sleep at all. He sat in the darkness with his rifle across his lap, listening. Ash lay nearby, alert but calm. The cabin was cold, despite the fire in the hearth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old timbers creak. At 3 in the morning, Garrett heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest. The snap of a branch that was too heavy to be an animal. The crunch of footsteps in snow, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. Ash's ears pricked forward. The dog stood silently and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness. Garrett extinguished the lantern with a quick breath. He waited for his eyes to adjust, counting seconds, controlling his breathing. This was what he had trained for. What he had done in compounds from Kandahar to Helmand. The difference was the uniform of the enemy. Through the window he saw movement. Two shapes darker than the surrounding night. They wore tactical gear, moved with professional discipline. Not local thugs. Professionals. One moved toward the front door, the other circled toward the back. Standard two-man entry. They would breach, simultaneously overwhelm any resistance with speed and surprise. Garrett had other ideas. He moved to the side of the door, his rifle ready. He gave Ash a hand signal. The dog understood, immediately moving to a position behind the heavy table where he would be protected, but could still attack. The lock on the door clicked. Someone was picking it, the sound barely audible over the wind. Garrett's finger rested beside the trigger guard, ready but disciplined. He needed to know who these men were, who had sent them. The door began to open slowly. A sliver of darkness widened. The barrel of a suppressed submachine gun preceded the man into the room. Ash didn't wait for a command. The dog launched himself like a missile, 80 pounds of trained fury, hitting the intruder before he cleared the threshold. The man's scream was cut short as Ash's jaws locked onto his forearm. The weapon clattered to the floor. Garrett kicked it away and pressed the rifle barrel to the back of the man's head. "Down," he commanded. "Face down, hands behind your head." The second intruder was coming through the kitchen. Garrett heard glass breaking. He fired a shot into the ceiling, the muzzle blast deafening in the enclosed space. "Federal trespassing," Garrett roared, using the command voice he'd learned in the Marines. "On the ground now, or the next one goes through your chest." The second man appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, his weapon raised. He saw his partner on the ground with the dog standing over him, and Garrett's rifle aimed at center mass. For a heartbeat, Garrett thought the man would fire. Thought this would end in gunfire and blood. Then the man lowered his weapon. "Easy," he said, his voice muffled by a balaclava. "We're just doing a job." "Drop it. Kick it toward me." The man complied. Garrett kept his rifle trained on him while using his boot to push both weapons out of reach. "Who sent you?" Neither man answered. "I can call the sheriff," Garrett said. "Have you arrested for breaking and entering, armed burglary, maybe attempted murder? Or you can tell me who's paying you and walk out of here." The man on the floor, the one Ash had taken down, spoke through gritted teeth. "We don't know names. We got a contract through a security firm. Anonymous client. We were just supposed to scare you, make you leave. By breaking in armed in the middle of the night. By showing you that you're not safe here. That nowhere is safe if you keep pushing." Garrett considered this. These men were contractors, deniable assets. If he called local law enforcement, the sheriff would make them disappear before they could testify. If he killed them, he'd be the one going to prison. He made a decision. "Get up, both of you, leave the weapons, walk back to whatever vehicle you came in, drive away. If I see either of you again, I won't bother with questions." The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for the door, the one Ash had bitten, clutching his bleeding arm. Within seconds, Garrett heard an engine start somewhere down the logging road. Headlights flashed through the trees and then faded into the distance. Ash returned to Garrett's side, his muzzle flecked with blood. The dog sat looking up at his handler with calm eyes. Just another day at work. Garrett let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with him. He secured the weapons the men had left behind, then checked the dog for injuries. Ash was fine. Professional. Perfect. Good boy, Garrett whispered, running his hand over the dog's head. Good boy. But as he stood in the darkness surrounded by the evidence of the attack, Garrett knew the truth. This was just the beginning. Blackwood had sent a message. He could reach Garrett anywhere. Could send men in the night. Could make him disappear like Cross. The war had started, and Garrett Kane was outnumbered, outgunned, and standing alone in the wilderness. Almost alone. He looked down at Ash, who watched him with unwavering loyalty. Not alone, not quite, but close enough that the odds didn't look good. Outside, the wind howled through the pines and the temperature dropped towards zero. The Montana night was vast and cold and indifferent to the small drama playing out in a forgotten cabin on a cursed piece of land. Garrett moved to the window and looked out at the darkness. Somewhere out there, Silas Blackwood was making his next move. Somewhere, Sheriff Riggs was being given new orders. Somewhere, the machinery of wealth and power was grinding into motion to crush one inconvenient veteran who didn't know when to quit. But Garrett Kane had never been good at quitting. It wasn't in his training. It wasn't in his nature. He would see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. The decision came to Garrett Kane at 4 a.m. in the darkness before dawn, when the truth is sharpest and excuses fall away like dead leaves. He couldn't win a siege. One man and a dog against unlimited resources and ruthless determination. Blackwood would send more contractors. Better trained, more heavily armed. They would come in waves until Garrett was dead or broken. The only way to survive was to stop being prey. To take the fight out of the shadows and into the light where wealth and corruption couldn't hide. He needed to get the evidence out of the valley, to someone who could make it public before Nexus could bury it along with him. Garrett moved through the cabin, methodically packing what he would need for the journey down the mountain. The ammunition box with its 47 vials went into a waterproof bag. The journals followed, wrapped in layers of protection. He loaded extra magazines for the Glock, a tactical flashlight, emergency supplies. Everything a soldier would carry on a mission behind enemy lines. Because that's what this was. Enemy territory. The sheriff was compromised. The local government was bought. He was operating alone in hostile country with no support and no extraction plan. Just like Afghanistan. Except the mountains were colder and the enemy wore American flags on their lapels. Ash watched from his position near the door, golden eyes tracking every movement. The dog knew something was coming, could sense the change in Garrett's energy, the shift from defensive to offensive. "You're staying here," Garrett said quietly. "Guard the cabin. I'll be back before dark." The dog's ears flicked forward. A soft whine emerged from his chest. Not fear, protest. In 5 years of working together, they had never separated during a mission. Garrett knelt and placed both hands on either side of Ash's head, looking directly into those intelligent eyes. "I need you here. If they come back, you're the early warning. You're the last line." He scratched behind the dog's ears. "I trust you with my life. Now I need you to trust me with yours." Ash leaned into the touch, then sat back on his haunches. Acceptance. The dog would hold the position. Garrett stood and shouldered his pack. The weight was familiar, comforting. 60 pounds of gear and evidence. 60 pounds of responsibility for the dead and the dying. He stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing his breath. The thermometer he'd mounted on the porch read -12 Fahrenheit. The sky was clear stars visible in crystalline sharpness. Bad weather was coming. He could feel it in his bones in the particular quality of the air that promised snow. He had maybe 6 hours before the next storm hit. 6 hours to hike 12 miles down the mountain, reach civilization, and upload the evidence to someone who could protect it. 6 hours to save his life or seal his fate. The journey down was brutal. The logging road was barely passable in daylight. In darkness, it became a gauntlet of ice and hidden obstacles. Garrett moved with tactical precision, using his flashlight, sparingly relying on starlight and memory to navigate. His breath came in frozen plumes. His fingers went numb despite heavy gloves. At the 2-mile mark, he paused to rest. His legs were burning from the constant downhill strain. The sky to the east was beginning to show the first gray hints of dawn. He thought about Benjamin Cross. Imagine the man making this same journey 3 years ago, carrying the same burden of terrible knowledge. Had Cross tried to get the evidence out? Had he made it this far before they caught him? Another memory surfaced. Afghanistan, 2013. Patrol base wilderness deep in the Kunar Valley. Garrett had been a sergeant by then, leading his own squad. Cross had been rotated back for his final deployment, serving as the company first sergeant. They'd been pinned down by Taliban fighters in a compound, taking accurate fire from 3 directions. The radio had been hit, no comms with higher, no air support coming, just 20 Marines and the ammunition they carried. Cross had found Garrett during a lull in the fighting. "Kane," he'd said, his face streaked with dust and sweat, "I need you to do something for me." "Yes, First Sergeant." Cross had pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "My daughter's getting married next month. I'm supposed to walk her down the aisle. If I don't make it out of this valley, I need you to give this to her. It's letters I've been writing. Things I want her to know." Garrett had taken the notebook. "You'll give it to her yourself, First Sergeant." "Maybe, but if I don't, you make sure she gets it. You promise me that." "I promise." They'd made it out. Cross had walked his daughter down the aisle, but the lesson had stuck with Garrett. A promise to a fellow Marine was sacred. You kept it no matter what it cost you. Cross had made Garrett promise to finish what he'd started, to not let the evidence die with him, to make sure the truth got out. Garrett would keep that promise, even if it killed him. He pushed himself upright and kept walking. The pain in his legs faded into the background, just another sensation to be noted and ignored. He'd marched longer distances in worse conditions, carrying heavier loads. This was nothing. This was just the price of doing what needed to be done. By the time he reached the outskirts of Flathead, the sun was a pale disk behind thick clouds rolling in from the west. The storm was coming faster than he'd anticipated. He had maybe 3 hours of clear weather left. The storage facility sat on the industrial edge of town, a collection of corrugated metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence. Garrett had rented a unit here 2 weeks ago, under a false name, paying 6 months in advance with cash. It was his contingency, his bolt hole. He approached carefully, scanning for surveillance. The facility had cameras, but they were old and poorly maintained, more for insurance purposes than actual security. He kept his head down and moved quickly to Unit 47. The door rolled up with a metallic screech. Inside was exactly what he'd left: a folding table, a battery-powered camping lantern, and a ruggedized laptop he'd bought used from an Army surplus store. Garrett set up quickly. He pulled the journals from his pack and began photographing each page with the laptop's camera. The process was tedious but necessary. High-resolution images of every entry, every photograph, every piece of documentation Cross had compiled. While the laptop processed the images, he carefully opened each vial and photographed the labels, then resealed them. 47 pieces of physical evidence. 47 witnesses to corporate murder. The upload process took longer. He was using an encrypted server, bouncing the signal through multiple VPNs to mask the origin. The connection was slow, the progress bar crawling across the screen with agonizing lethargy. Garrett pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never called. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. Mail alert despite the early hour. "Webb. Marcus Webb, investigative journalist with the Associated Press." "Speaking. Who is this?" "My name is Garrett Kane. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, currently in Flathead County, Montana. I have evidence of corporate environmental crimes that have resulted in multiple deaths. I'm about to send you encrypted files containing documentation, water samples, analysis, and testimony from medical professionals." There was a pause on the other end. Garrett could hear the scratch of pen on paper. Webb was taking notes. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" 15 years of illegal toxic waste dumping by Nexus Mining Corporation. Contamination of groundwater, affecting 800 residents. Cancer clusters, birth defects. At least 3 whistleblowers who died under suspicious circumstances trying to expose this. "That's a serious accusation. Can you verify the chain of custody on this evidence?" The primary investigator was Benjamin Cross, former Marine Corps sergeant. He compiled the evidence between 1919 and 2021 before he disappeared. "I recovered his documentation from a hidden cache on property I legally own." "Disappeared how?" "Vanished without a trace in November 2022. No body found. Local law enforcement concluded he wandered off and died of exposure. I believe he was murdered to silence him." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Kane, if what you're saying is true, you're in significant danger. Have you contacted federal authorities?" "Can't trust local law. Sheriff is on Nexus payroll. So is a state senator. I need this evidence public before they can bury it. And me with it." Where are you right now? Can't tell you that. What I can tell you is this: I'm uploading the files to an encrypted server. You'll receive the access codes in 15 minutes. If I don't call you by 0700 hours this morning, you publish everything. Send it to the FB, EPA, every major news outlet you can reach. You make this so public they can't kill it. Mr. Kane, wait. 0700 web, not a minute later. If I don't call, it means I'm dead or captured. Either way, the story goes public. Garrett ended the call before the journalist could argue. The laptop chimed, upload complete. He typed out the access codes and sent them to Webb's encrypted email. Then he physically destroyed the encryption keys, snapping the USB drive in half and grinding the pieces under his boot heel. The bridge was burned. There was no pulling back now. He gathered the physical evidence, repacked his bag, and stepped out of the storage unit. The snow had started falling, big fat flakes that came down in sheets already accumulating on the ground. The storm had arrived. Garrett pulled up his hood and started walking back toward where he'd hidden the truck. He moved quickly, scanning constantly for threats. The streets were nearly empty this early on a Sunday morning. The few cars that passed paid him no attention. He was 50 yards from the truck when he saw them. 2 Flathead County Sheriff's vehicles blocking the road ahead. 4 deputies standing in a semicircle around his Ford waiting. Sheriff Riggs stood in the center, arms crossed, breath steaming in the cold air. Garrett stopped. His hand drifted toward the Glock under his jacket. 4 armed men, all with legal authority, all probably on Nexus payroll. The math didn't work. He couldn't shoot his way through this. Riggs called out across the distance, "Mr. Kane, we need to have a conversation." About what? About breaking and entering, theft, making terroristic threats against prominent citizens. Riggs started walking toward him slowly. "We got a complaint from Mr. Blackwood. Says you've been harassing him, trespassing on company property, stealing confidential documents." "I haven't stolen anything. The evidence I have came from land I own legally. That's a matter of interpretation. Either way, you need to come with us. We'll sort it all out at the station." Garrett understood immediately. This was the play. Arrest him on fabricated charges. Hold him incommunicado while Blackwood's people erased the evidence. By the time anyone realized what happened, Garrett would have had an unfortunate accident in his cell. Just like Benjamin Cross had an unfortunate accident in the woods. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Garrett said clearly. The deputies' hands moved to their weapons. Not drawing yet, but ready. Riggs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "That's the wrong answer, Kane. You're under arrest. You can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. You want to arrest me, you'd better do it in the next 60 seconds. "Why's that?" "Because in less than a minute, evidence of Nexus Mining's crimes goes public. FBI, EPA, Washington Post, New York Times, every document Benjamin Cross compiled, every water sample showing contamination, every medical record showing what you people did to this valley." Garrett's voice was steel. "And when that happens, everyone who helped cover it up becomes a target, including you." Riggs's smile faltered. He pulled out his radio. "Get Blackwood on the line, now." Garrett didn't need to check his watch. He could feel the seconds ticking down like a countdown to detonation. The sheriff was talking urgently into his radio. The deputies were looking at each other, uncertain. They were local men. They'd grown up in this valley. Some of them probably had family who'd gotten sick from the contaminated water. They'd taken Nexus money, but they weren't professional killers. They were just corrupt cops who'd made bad choices. Riggs turned back to Garrett, his face flushed with anger. "What did you do? What Cross tried to do? What I should have done the moment I found his evidence. I made sure the truth couldn't die with me." 7 a.m. arrived like thunder. Somewhere in a newsroom in Washington, D.C., Marcus Webb was opening encrypted files, reading through years of documentation, seeing the photographs of illegal dumping, the medical records, the testimony, the physical evidence. And somewhere in Nexus Mining's corporate headquarters, lawyers were about to start receiving federal subpoenas. Garrett's phone rang. He pulled it out slowly, keeping his other hand visible. The screen showed Webb's number. "You did it?" the journalist said without preamble. "This is massive. I've already forwarded copies to federal prosecutors and the EPA, a criminal investigation division. This is going to bring down everyone connected to it." "Good," Garrett said. He looked at Sheriff Riggs. "You hear that? It's over. The secret's out." Riggs's face had gone pale. He took a step back, his hand falling away from his weapon. From behind Garrett came a new sound, the heavy rumble of a powerful engine. He turned to see the black Escalade speeding toward them, sliding slightly on the snow-slicked pavement. It screeched to a stop. Silas Blackwood emerged, his composure finally cracked. His expensive parka was unbuttoned. His hair was disheveled. He looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "You stupid bastard," Blackwood snarled at Garrett. "Do you have any idea what you've done, the economic impact, the strategic importance of those minerals?" "I know what you did to the people who lived here," Garrett replied calmly. "I know about the Callaways, the Brennans, the dozens of families you poisoned for profit. That's all I need to know." Blackwood took a step forward, his hand reaching into his coat. For a split second, Garrett thought the man was going for a weapon. His own hand moved to his Glock muscle memory taking over. But Blackwood pulled out his phone instead. He stared at the screen, his face cycling through shock, rage, and finally defeat. "Federal arrest warrants," he whispered. "They're issuing federal arrest warrants. EPA, FBI, Justice Department." He looked up at Garrett with eyes that held pure hatred. "This isn't over. I have lawyers. I have resources. You're just one man. You can't—" The sound of rotors cut through the air. Heavy, rhythmic, unmistakable. Garrett looked up to see two helicopters cresting the mountain ridge, flying low and fast. Blackbirds with government markings. FBI. They'd moved faster than he'd anticipated. Webb must have had direct contacts with federal law enforcement. Must have sent the evidence simultaneously to multiple agencies. The helicopters descended into the street rotors, creating a vortex of snow and wind. Armed agents in tactical gear poured out before the skids even touched down. "Silas Blackwood," a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Federal agents, you are under arrest for conspiracy, environmental crimes, and murder. Get on the ground now." For a moment, Blackwood stood frozen. Then his shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him all at once. He knelt in the snow hands behind his head. The FBI agents had swarmed the scene. More vehicles were arriving, blocking off the street. Garrett watched as they zip-tied Blackwood's wrists, as they read him his rights, as they led him to one of the helicopters, no longer a powerful CEO, but just another criminal in custody. Sheriff Riggs was next. Then his deputies. All of them cuffed, all of them silent, all of them finally understanding that the protection they'd counted on was gone. An agent approached Garrett, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone senior. "Mr. Kane." "Yes, ma'am." Special Agent Diane Morrison, FBI. "We've been investigating Nexus mining for 8 months. We had pieces of the puzzle but couldn't get enough evidence for warrants. What you provided this morning broke the case wide open." She gestured to the scene around them. "You did good work here." "I had help. Benjamin Cross did the real work. He paid for it with his life." Morrison nodded. "We'll need you to make a full statement. Walk us through how you obtained the evidence, chain of custody, everything. But I want you to know that Dr. Brennan contacted our field office 6 weeks ago. He's been cooperating with our investigation, wearing a wire documenting conversations with Nexus executives. Your upload this morning gave us corroboration from an independent source. That's what pushed the U.S. attorney to move forward with arrests." Garrett felt something loosen in his chest. Brennan. The doctor had found his courage after all, had been working behind the scenes while Garrett gathered Cross's evidence. They hadn't been alone. None of them had been alone. "There's someone else," Morrison said. "A third helicopter is bringing in Senator Harlow now. He tried to claim legislative immunity." Garrett looked down the street. Sure enough, a third bird was landing rotor wash, kicking up fresh snow. Two agents emerged, escorting a man in an expensive suit who walked with the practiced composure of a career politician trying to maintain dignity in the face of disaster. Senator James Harlow. Garrett recognized him from Cross's photographs. The man who had taken Nexus money and buried EPA reports. The man who had helped write the laws that let corporations poison communities with impunity. Harlow's face was a mask of dignified resignation, as if this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding that his lawyers would clear up by afternoon. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted left and right, looking for cameras, for witnesses, for any way to control the narrative. He wouldn't find any. The FBI had moved too fast. By the time Harlow's legal team assembled, the evidence would already be in federal custody, and his face would be on every news channel in America. Morrison gestured toward the senator. "He tried to claim legislative immunity. Didn't work. Conspiracy to commit murder overrides a lot of legal protections." Garrett watched as they led Harlow to the helicopter. The senator's perfect hair was already mussed by the rotor wash. His $1,000 shoes were getting soaked in the slush. He looked smaller somehow, less powerful. Just another man in handcuffs. "There's something else," Garrett said. "I left my dog at the cabin. I need to get back to him." Morrison smiled slightly. "We'll give you a ride. Helicopters faster than hiking through this storm. 20 minutes later, Garrett was standing in the clearing in front of the cabin. The helicopter lifted off behind him, returning to coordinate the arrests and evidence collection. The FBI would be processing the scene for days, but they'd promised to let him keep the land. It was his property legally purchased. Cross had made sure of that. Ash came bounding out of the cabin the moment Garrett's boots hit the ground. The dog circled him once, twice, checking for injuries, confirming his human was intact. Then he sat and looked up with eyes that asked a simple question. "It's done," Garrett said, kneeling to embrace the dog. "It's over. We won." The dog's tail wagged once. Mission accomplished. Garrett stood and looked at the cabin, at the trees beyond, at the mountains rising into the storm clouds. This land had cost Benjamin Cross his life, had nearly cost Garrett the same, but it was clean now. The secret was out. The poison would be remediated. The people responsible would face justice. And he was still standing. 3 months later, spring came to Montana like a slow exhale. The snow retreated in patches, revealing earth that had been frozen since November. Green appeared in tentative shoots. The air lost its razor edge and began to smell of growing things instead of ice. Garrett Kane stood in the clearing, surveying the progress. The old cabin was gone, consumed completely by the fire that Blackwood's men had set in those final desperate hours. All that remained was the stone chimney, standing like a monument to what had been. But around it, something new was rising. The frame of a house built from fresh-cut timber. Walls that were straight and true. Windows that would let in light instead of keeping out ghosts. Abernathy was there, his weathered hands still strong enough to swing a hammer. Dr. Brennan worked alongside him, the physician turned carpenter for a day. Ruth Calloway carried supplies, her face less lined with grief than it had been in winter. And there were others, families from the valley who had been sick and were starting to heal. People whose wells were being cleaned, whose soil was being remediated, whose children might grow up in a place that wasn't poisoned. They'd come to help build, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The trials were ongoing. Silas Blackwood faced 47 counts of environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering. Senator Harlow had resigned in disgrace, his political career destroyed overnight. Sheriff Riggs and his deputies were awaiting trial on corruption charges. The whole rotten structure was coming down one indictment at a time. Nexus Mining Corporation had declared bankruptcy. The EPA was overseeing the cleanup of 15 years of contamination. It would take a decade, maybe longer, but the valley would heal. Dr. Brennan had testified before a grand jury, his wire recordings providing crucial evidence of the conspiracy. His daughter was safe, his wife proud. The courage he'd found had cost him sleepless nights, but earned him back his self-respect. Ruth Calloway had given a victim impact statement at Blackwood's arraignment. She'd looked the CEO in the eye and told him exactly what he'd taken from her own. Tom's last letter had been entered into evidence. His words would outlive the man who'd killed him. And Marcus Webb had won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the scandal. The story had gone national, then international. Nexus Mining had become a cautionary tale about corporate greed and environmental destruction. Benjamin Cross's name was in every article. His sacrifice had not been in vain. Garrett hammered another nail into the frame, feeling the solid thunk of metal on wood. Honest work, clean work. Ash lay in the shade of the stone chimney, watching everything with calm attention. The dog's muzzle was graying slightly. 7.5 years old now, slowing down just a fraction, though still alert, still protective. "Hey, Kane," Abernathy called from across the construction site. "We're putting up the ridge beam. Need your height." Garrett smiled. It felt strange on his face, that expression, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. But it felt good, too. Natural. He joined the others, gripping one end of the heavy timber. On the count of 3, they lifted together. The beam rose, slotted into place. Someone drove the first securing nail. The house was taking shape. A real house built with clean hands and honest purpose. Built on land that had been bought for $500 and paid for with blood and truth. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the workers packed up their tools. They would return tomorrow, and the day after, until the house was finished and Garrett Kane had a real home instead of a mission. Abernathy paused before leaving his truck loaded with surplus lumber. "Ben would be proud," the old man said quietly. "What you did, how you finished what he started." Garrett looked at the stone chimney, all that remained of Cross's cabin. "He did the hard part. He paid the price. I just made sure it mattered. Still, he chose well when he left that evidence for you to find. He knew you wouldn't run. Running never solved anything." Abernathy nodded and climbed into his truck. One by one, the others departed their vehicles, kicking up dust on the newly cleared access road. The logging route had been graded and maintained, no longer a forgotten track but a proper road. Finally, it was just Garrett and Ash in the clearing. The dog stood and walked to his side, leaning against his leg with comfortable weight. Garrett looked out at the valley below, at the creek running clear again after months of treatment, at the forest standing quiet and patient as it had for centuries, at the sky deepening from blue to purple to the black of coming night. Stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that had watched Benjamin Cross die alone and afraid, the same stars that had seen Garrett arrive in winter, desperate and lost, the same stars that would watch this land heal and endure long after everyone alive today was dust. "This is where I stand," Garrett said aloud, the words carried away on the evening breeze. Ash's tail wagged once. Behind them, the frame of the new house stood dark against the sunset, a promise of shelter and permanence. In front of them, the valley stretched out toward forever scarred, but healing, poisoned, but recovering. Garrett Kane had come to Montana looking for a place to disappear. Instead, he'd found a reason to stay, had found a fight worth finishing and a piece of land worth defending. The ghosts were quiet now. The secrets were told. The poison was being drawn from the earth. What remained was the work of living, of building, of standing guard over the fragile, precious things that men like Benjamin Cross had died to protect. Garrett turned and walked toward the temporary shelter where he'd been sleeping while the house rose. Ash padded beside him, faithful and steady. Tomorrow they would work again, raise more walls, secure more timbers, build something that would last. But tonight, in the gathering dark, Garrett Kane stood on land he had bought for $500 and defended with everything he had. And for the first time in 12 years, since before Afghanistan, and before the war, and before the world had taught him that honor was a luxury and justice was a lie, Garrett Kane felt something close to peace. The mountains stood silent above him. The stars wheeled overhead. The dog pressed warm against his leg. And in the ruins of a cabin where secrets had been buried and truth had been hidden, a new house was rising, built on ashes, built on sacrifice, built on the unshakable foundation of men who refused to run when the darkness came for them. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. And Garrett Kane, veteran and witness and guardian of the truth, was finally impossibly home.